Hi there. I'm Brenda, and I just turned 58 years old last month. You know, birthdays have always been special in our family, especially since my husband George passed away 3 years ago. I was so excited about this particular birthday because my son Marcus promised he'd make it memorable. After all the lonely evenings I'd spent in our old house, I was looking forward to having my family around me sharing cake and just feeling loved. But what happened that day changed everything between us forever. Sometimes the people closest to you can cut the deepest, and I learned that lesson in the most painful way possible. Before we dive into what happened on that devastating birthday, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt unappreciated by family, and don't forget to subscribe because this story will show you exactly what happens when a mother finally decides enough is enough. Growing up, I always believed that sacrifice was the foundation of motherhood. After George died suddenly from a stroke 3 years ago, that belief became my entire world. I had spent 35 years as a dedicated wife and mother, working part-time as a bookkeeper while raising Marcus in our cozy suburban home in Denver. When George passed, I thought Marcus and I would grow even closer, supporting each other through the grief. For the first year after the funeral, that seemed to be exactly what was happening. Marcus had always been such a thoughtful son. Even as a busy software engineer with his own family, he'd call me twice a week and visit every Sunday with his wife Stephanie and their 8-year-old boy Jake. I was so proud of everything he'd accomplished. The beautiful house in Highlands Ranch, his successful career, his loving family. All of it was possible because I had worked multiple jobs during his college years, sometimes cleaning offices at night after my regular bookkeeping work during the day. George and I had sacrificed our own dreams of traveling and retirement savings to make sure Marcus graduated debt-free from the University of Colorado. But over the past year, something had shifted. The weekly calls became monthly. The Sunday visits turned into brief holiday stops. When Stephanie's mother, Dorothy, started spending more time with their family, I noticed Marcus seemed to have less and less time for me. Dorothy owned a small hair salon and was always talking about her business success and independence. She was the same age as me, 55, but she carried herself like she owned the world. Every conversation somehow circled back to her achievements and how proud she was of never depending on anyone. I tried not to feel threatened, but it was hard to ignore how Marcus's eyes lit up when Dorothy talked about her latest business expansion or the expensive gifts she bought for Stephanie and Jake. Meanwhile, when I mentioned needing help with small repairs around my house or feeling lonely on weekends, Marcus would give me a distracted nod and change the subject. Still, I held on to hope that our bond would strengthen again, especially with my 58th birthday approaching. When Marcus called 2 weeks before my birthday, asking what I wanted to do to celebrate, my heart soared. Just having my family together would be perfect, I told him. Maybe we could have cake at your house, and Jake could help me blow out the candles like we used to. Marcus agreed enthusiastically, saying Stephanie was already planning something special. For the first time in months, I felt like I mattered to my son again. I spent those 2 weeks imagining how wonderful it would be to feel surrounded by love on my special day. The morning of my birthday, I woke up with genuine excitement coursing through my veins. I had barely slept like a child on Christmas morning. The first thing I did was check my phone, expecting the traditional early morning birthday call from Marcus. We had maintained that ritual for decades, even when he was away at college. But 7 o'clock came and went with silence. 8 o'clock passed without a ring. By 9:30, I convinced myself he was probably planning to surprise me when I arrived at his house. I spent extra time getting ready, choosing my navy blue dress that George always said brought out my eyes. I styled my graying hair carefully, and even put on the pearl earrings Marcus had given me for Mother's Day 5 years ago. Looking in the mirror, I tried to see myself through my son's eyes. Did I look like a woman who deserved celebrating? The reflection staring back at me seemed older and more fragile than I remembered, but I pushed those thoughts away. Today was going to be about reconnecting with my family. The drive to Marcus's house in Highlands Ranch took 45 minutes through Denver traffic, but I didn't mind. I spent the time planning conversation topics and imagining Jake running to hug me at the door. When I pulled into their circular driveway, my stomach dropped slightly. Dorothy's silver Mercedes was parked in the spot where I usually left my modest Honda Civic. Her car looked freshly washed and expensive next to the other vehicles. I parked on the street and walked up the stone pathway carrying the small gift I'd brought for Jake. Stephanie answered the door wearing a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Brenda, you're here," she said, as if my arrival was unexpected despite our confirmed plans. "Come on in, I guess." The lukewarm greeting stung, but I stepped inside and immediately heard Dorothy's distinctive laugh echoing from the kitchen. She was telling some animated story while Marcus chuckled appreciatively in the background. When I entered the kitchen, the conversation paused momentarily. "Happy birthday, Mom," Marcus said without getting up from the breakfast bar where he sat next to Dorothy. His tone was polite but distant, like he was greeting an acquaintance rather than his mother on her special day. Dorothy turned to give me a brief wave, her fingers adorned with rings that caught the light. "Brenda, dear, you look lovely," she said in a voice that somehow managed to sound both complimentary and condescending. "I was just telling Marcus about the new investment opportunity I'm considering for my salon expansion." Jake was sprawled on the living room floor, completely absorbed in his video game. When I called his name, he glanced up briefly and mumbled, "Hi, Grandma," before returning to his screen. The lack of enthusiasm from my own grandson felt like a small knife to my heart. I had always been the grandmother who brought homemade cookies and played board games for hours. When had I become someone who warranted only a distracted greeting? What should have been a birthday lunch felt more like a business meeting where I wasn't invited to participate. Dorothy had somehow positioned herself as the center of attention, regaling everyone with stories about her salon's success and her plans for opening a second location. Marcus hung on her every word, asking detailed questions about profit margins and marketing strategies. Meanwhile, I sat at the end of the table, picking at my sandwich and wondering when I had become invisible in my own son's life. "Dorothy, your entrepreneurial spirit is just incredible," Stephanie gushed, refilling Dorothy's wineglass for the third time. "I wish more women our age had your drive and independence." The emphasis on independence felt pointed, and I couldn't help but notice how Stephanie avoided making eye contact with me during the compliment. Dorothy preened under the attention, adjusting her silk scarf and launching into another story about networking with important clients. The conversation then shifted to their upcoming family vacation plans. Marcus and Stephanie were discussing a cruise to the Caribbean over spring break, and Dorothy was offering advice about the best excursions and restaurants. They debated the merits of different cabin locations and shore activities with animated enthusiasm. I listened for 15 minutes before realizing that not once had anyone asked if I might like to join them, or even acknowledged that I was sitting right there, hearing about this family trip for the first time. "What about you, Mom?" Marcus finally said, almost as an afterthought. "What are you planning to do this spring?" Before I could answer, Dorothy jumped in with, "Oh, Brenda probably prefers to stay close to home. Some people find traveling stressful at our age." Her comment stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. Since George died, I had become more cautious about venturing far from familiar surroundings. But hearing it said aloud in front of my family made me sound pathetic and fearful. Marcus nodded in agreement with Dorothy's assessment. "Mom's always been a homebody," he said, as if that explained why she wouldn't be included in family adventures. "She's comfortable with her routines." The word comfortable felt like a dismissal, reducing my entire personality to someone who was set in her ways and resistant to change. I wanted to protest to remind him of all the adventures George and I had planned before his death, but the words stuck in my throat. The most painful part was watching how Marcus sought Dorothy's approval for every decision, from choosing dessert to planning weekend activities. When Dorothy suggested they should visit a wine tasting event the following Saturday, Marcus immediately agreed and asked Stephanie to put it on their calendar. When I mentioned that I had been hoping we could have Jake over for a sleepover soon, Marcus said they'd have to check their busy schedule and get back to me. The contrast in his responses couldn't have been more obvious. Then came the moment that shattered my heart into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. After lunch, Marcus disappeared into his study and returned carrying an elegant blue jewelry box with silver ribbon. My pulse quickened with anticipation. Finally, my birthday gift. But instead of walking toward me, he approached Dorothy with a broad smile. "Dorothy, I wanted to give you something to show how grateful our family is for everything you do," Marcus announced, presenting the box with ceremony. "You've been such an incredible influence on Stephanie and Jake, and honestly on me too. Your wisdom and guidance mean the world to us." Dorothy's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine surprise as she carefully untied the ribbon. When she opened the box, even I gasped at the contents. Nestled inside was a stunning diamond tennis bracelet that Must have cost at least $15,000. The stones caught the afternoon light streaming through the dining room windows, creating tiny rainbows across the table. Dorothy held it up with trembling hands, and for a moment I thought she might actually cry from happiness. Marcus, this is absolutely gorgeous, but I can't accept something so expensive, she said, though her grip on the bracelet suggested otherwise. Nonsense, Marcus replied, his voice filled with warmth I hadn't heard directed toward me in months. You deserve beautiful things. You've taught me what unconditional love and support really look like. You never ask for anything, but you give everything to the people you care about. As he fastened the bracelet around Dorothy's wrist, my mind reeled with confusion. What did he mean by unconditional love? What about all the years I had sacrificed my own needs to support his dreams? But Marcus wasn't finished. Actually, there's more, he continued, pulling out an envelope. Stephanie and I want to take you on that Hawaiian vacation you mentioned wanting. First-class flights, oceanfront suite, the whole experience. You work so hard at the salon, and you've earned a real vacation. Dorothy pressed her hand to her chest in apparent shock, thanking him repeatedly and calling him the most thoughtful son-in-law she could have imagined. I sat frozen in my chair watching this elaborate gift-giving ceremony and waiting for my turn. Surely my own birthday gifts were coming next. Maybe Marcus was saving the best for last, building up to an even more meaningful gesture for his mother. But as the minutes ticked by and Dorothy continued to admire her new bracelet while discussing vacation plans, the horrible realization crept in that there was no gift for me. Nothing wrapped, nothing planned, nothing to acknowledge that this was supposed to be my special day. When I finally found my voice, it came out smaller than I intended. Marcus, did you perhaps forget something? I asked, trying to keep the hurt out of my tone. I mean, about today being my birthday. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Jake's video game in the background. Marcus looked genuinely confused for a moment, as if he were trying to remember what I might be referring to. Oh, Mom, he said with a dismissive wave. You don't need expensive things at your age. You should be happy just being here with family. Besides, you've never been one for flashy jewelry or fancy trips. His casual dismissal of my birthday hit like a physical blow. Dorothy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly very interested in examining her new bracelet. Stephanie busied herself clearing dessert plates that were already clean. But the worst was yet to come. As I struggled to process the inequality of the gift-giving, Marcus seemed to gain momentum in his hurtful comparisons. He gestured toward Dorothy with obvious admiration and said words that would replay in my mind for months afterward. Mom Dorothy has taught me what real maternal love looks like. She never asks for anything, never makes anyone feel guilty, and never expects to be taken care of. She built her own life, her own success without depending on other people. The implication hung in the air like poison. Unlike some people who always expect to be taken care of. He didn't have to say it directly for everyone in the room to understand exactly who he meant. Dorothy tried to interrupt with, Marcus, maybe we shouldn't, but he was on a roll now, apparently feeling the need to elaborate on his newfound wisdom about motherhood. I used to think love meant making sacrifices and putting your children first no matter what. He continued, his voice taking on an almost lecturing tone. But Dorothy showed me that real love is about building something meaningful with your life so your children can be proud of you. It's about being independent and strong, not needing constant reassurance or financial help or emotional support. Each word felt carefully chosen to wound me, even though his tone remained conversational. Stephanie, emboldened by her husband's speech, decided to add her own commentary. Your mother just sits at home all day managing her little budget and worrying about minor repairs while Dorothy built a thriving business from nothing. She's truly inspiring to watch. She never complains about being lonely or hints about wanting more attention. She just lives her life with dignity and purpose. The characterization of my quiet retirement years as pathetic self-pity was devastating. Yes, I lived simply on my modest pension and Social Security. Yes, I sometimes felt overwhelmed by home maintenance tasks that George used to handle. Yes, I occasionally mentioned feeling isolated during the long winter evenings. But I had never realized that my son viewed these normal aspects of widowhood as character flaws that needed correction. Jake, bless his innocent heart, chose that moment to look up from his game and ask the question that crystallized the entire horrible situation. Dad, How come Grandma Dorothy gets such pretty presents and Grandma Brenda doesn't get any presents? Isn't it Grandma Brenda's birthday today? The pure confusion in his young voice highlighted the absurdity of what was happening, but instead of prompting Marcus to recognize his cruelty, it only seemed to irritate him. Jake, go back to your game, Marcus snapped with more sharpness than was necessary. Adults are talking about adult things you wouldn't understand. The little boy's face fell, and he returned to his video game with the dejected posture of someone who had been unfairly scolded. In that moment, I realized that my grandson was learning to treat me as an afterthought just like his father had. Something inside me shifted in that moment like a switch being flipped from heartbreak to clarity. I could have screamed, could have defended myself, could have reminded Marcus of every sacrifice I'd made for his success. I could have listed the jobs I worked to pay his college tuition while Dorothy was building her salon with money from her ex-husband's settlement. I could have mentioned the nights I stayed up helping him with homework while she was out socializing at business networking events. But what would be the point? My son had clearly rewritten our family history to cast me as the burdensome mother and Dorothy as the inspirational figure. Any defense I offered would only be seen as more evidence of my neediness and self-pity. The painful truth was that Marcus didn't want to remember my sacrifices because they made him feel guilty about his current treatment of me. It was much easier for him to believe I had always been dependent and Dorothy had always been admirable. Instead of fighting a battle I couldn't win, I quietly stood up from the table and walked to the entryway where I had left my purse. My movements felt mechanical, like I was operating on autopilot. Behind me, the conversation resumed as if nothing had happened. Dorothy was thanking Marcus again for the bracelet, and Stephanie was pulling up photos of Hawaiian resorts on her phone. The normalcy of their interaction while I gathered my things to leave felt surreal. I'm going to head home now, I announced from the doorway, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Marcus glanced up with mild surprise as if he had forgotten I was still there. Oh, okay, Mom. Drive safely, he said, already turning back to the vacation planning discussion. No one asked why I was leaving early. No one suggested we hadn't properly celebrated my birthday yet. No one seemed to notice that the guest of honor was departing without cake, without singing, without any of the traditions that had marked birthdays in our family for decades. The walk to my car felt endless. I kept expecting someone to run after me to realize how badly they had treated me to call out an apology or invitation to come back inside, but the only sound was Dorothy's laughter floating through the open dining room window as she described some amusing incident from her salon. I sat in my Honda for several minutes before starting the engine, staring at the beautiful house my son lived in and wondering when I had become unwelcome in it. The drive home passed in a blur of tears and racing thoughts. How had I failed so completely as a mother that my own son felt comfortable humiliating me in front of his in-laws? When had my love and sacrifice become burdens instead of gifts? What was I supposed to do with the rest of my life if even my own child saw me as pathetic and demanding? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew that something fundamental had changed forever between Marcus and me. That evening, sitting alone in the house George and I had shared for 28 years, I made a decision that would alter the course of all our lives. I wasn't going to beg for my son's love anymore, and I wasn't going to accept being treated as a lesser member of my own family. If Marcus wanted to worship Dorothy's independence and success, then I would show him what real independence looked like. My first step was to call Patterson and Associates, the law firm that had handled George's estate. I made an appointment with James Patterson himself for the following Monday. I told his secretary it was urgent and related to updating my will and financial planning. Over the weekend, I began researching Dorothy's supposedly thriving business empire. What I discovered was fascinating and useful. Through a friend who worked at the county clerk's office, I learned that Dorothy's salon had filed for 3 business loans in the past 18 months. Public records showed 2 liens against her property for unpaid contractor bills. Her ex-husband had indeed provided a settlement, but court documents indicated it was far smaller than Dorothy had implied to my family. Most interesting of all, her Mercedes was leased, not owned, and she was currently 2 payments behind, according to my friend's contact at the dealership. The woman Marcus held up as a model of financial independence was actually drowning in debt and desperately maintaining appearances. No wonder she had attached herself so firmly to Marcus and Stephanie's family. Their generosity wasn't just appreciated, it was probably essential to keeping her elaborate facade from collapsing. The expensive bracelet and Hawaiian vacation weren't just gifts, they were financial lifelines disguised as appreciation. Armed with this information, I began planning my own transformation. I had been living like a poor widow for 3 years, carefully budgeting every dollar and denying myself small luxuries out of habit. But when I added up my actual assets, the total was shocking. George's life insurance policy had paid out $400,000. Our house bought decades ago was now worth $350,000 in the current market. My pension and Social Security provided a comfortable monthly income that I had been saving rather than spending. I was not the financial burden Marcus seemed to think I was. In fact, I was probably in better financial shape than he was considering his expensive mortgage and lifestyle. The realization was both empowering and infuriating. I had been playing the role of the struggling widow while actually sitting on a substantial nest egg that could fund any kind of life I wanted to create. Mr. Patterson confirmed what I had suspected during our Monday meeting. As my son and only heir, Marcus naturally expected to inherit everything when I died. He had probably already factored my assets into his long-term financial planning. The house alone would provide a significant windfall, not to mention the savings and investments George had left behind. No wonder Marcus felt comfortable treating me poorly. In his mind, I was dependent on him for emotional support while he was depending on me for future financial security. But I was about to change that equation entirely. Mr. Patterson helped me draft a new will that left my entire estate to St. Joseph's Children's Hospital, where George had received excellent care during his final weeks. Marcus would inherit exactly nothing except the knowledge that his cruelty had cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars. The paperwork would be finalized within 2 weeks, and I felt lighter with every signature. 6 months later, my new life was everything I had dreamed it could be. I sold the house in March and moved to a luxury apartment complex downtown with a doorman fitness center and rooftop garden. My neighbors were other active retirees who traveled, took classes, and pursued hobbies with enthusiasm. I joined a book club, started piano lessons, and signed up for a watercolor painting workshop. For the first time in years, I woke up excited about my days instead of just enduring them. The phone call I had been expecting finally came on a rainy Thursday morning in late September. Marcus's voice was strained and desperate when I answered. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something urgent," he began without his usual pleasantries. "Dorothy's salon went bankrupt and she owes money to some pretty serious people. She's been asking us for help, but Stephanie and I are already stretched thin with our own bills. I was hoping maybe you could consider a loan from your savings." I let him continue for several minutes outlining Dorothy's financial crisis and their family's cash flow problems. He mentioned the cruise they had booked, Jake's private school tuition, and their recent kitchen renovation as reasons why they couldn't help Dorothy themselves. He seemed genuinely surprised when I told him I wouldn't be providing any loans to Dorothy or anyone else. "But mom family helps family," he argued, unconsciously echoing words I had said to him countless times over the years. "Dorothy has been so good to us, and she's practically family now. Surely you can spare $20,000 or $30,000 to help her get back on her feet. You're not spending your savings on anything important anyway." That last comment revealed everything I needed to know about how Marcus still viewed me and my life. He assumed I was still sitting at home, pinching pennies and waiting to be useful to my family. He had no idea I had been living my best life for months, spending money on experiences and possessions that brought me joy. The assumption that my savings weren't being used for anything important showed he still saw me as someone whose own needs and desires didn't matter. I suggested we meet for coffee to discuss the situation face to face. Marcus agreed eagerly, probably thinking he could be more persuasive in person. We met at a trendy cafe near my new apartment, and I could see his surprise when I walked in wearing a stylish outfit I had purchased during a recent shopping trip with my new friend Eleanor from the book club. I looked like a woman who was thriving, not surviving, and it clearly wasn't what he had expected. Over coffee, Marcus made his pitch with increasing desperation. Dorothy was apparently being threatened by creditors, and her business closure had left several employees without jobs right before the holidays. Stephanie was stressed about the situation, and Jake had been asking why Grandma Dorothy seemed so sad lately. Marcus painted a picture of a family crisis that required immediate financial intervention from the only person who had the resources to help. "I can't do it, Marcus," I said simply when he finished his presentation. "I've made other plans for my money and I won't be changing them." He stared at me in disbelief as if I had spoken in a foreign language. The idea that I might have my own priorities and commitments seemed impossible for him to process. "What other plans?" he demanded. "What could you possibly need that much money for?" I smiled and pulled out a folder containing my new will bank statements showing my recent expenditures and brochures from the European river cruise I had booked for the spring. His face went through several expressions as he examined the documents from confusion to shock to something approaching panic. The new will was the final blow. When Marcus realized that his inheritance had been redirected to charity, his whole demeanor changed. The son who had been pleading for help just minutes earlier was now demanding to know how I could be so vindictive and selfish. "You're punishing me because of one bad day," he accused. "You're going to destroy my financial future over a birthday party that went wrong." "One bad day," I repeated calmly. "Marcus, that birthday was the culmination of months of disrespect and dismissal. You've treated me like a burden and an embarrassment while worshiping Dorothy as some kind of maternal ideal. Now you want me to rescue her from the consequences of her own poor choices. The irony is almost funny." Marcus tried several different approaches over the next hour. He apologized for the birthday incident, claiming he had been stressed about work and hadn't realized how his words sounded. He promised that things would be different going forward, that he would make more effort to include me in family activities. He even suggested that Dorothy had manipulated him and Stephanie, playing up her successes while hiding her problems. But it was too late for apologies and excuses. I had spent 6 months building a life that didn't revolve around earning my son's approval, and I wasn't willing to go back to being the grateful, undemanding mother he wanted when it was convenient for him. My new will would stand, my boundaries would remain firm, and Dorothy's problems would not become my responsibility. When Marcus realized I was serious, he made one final attempt to change my mind. He brought Jake to my apartment building the following weekend, hoping that seeing his grandfather would soften my resolve. But even that backfire worked in my favor. Jake was amazed by my beautiful new home and excited to hear about my upcoming travels and activities. "Grandma, you're like a movie star now," he said, exploring my balcony garden and asking if he could visit more often. Through our conversation, I learned that Jake had been asking questions about why I had stopped coming to family dinners and why Grandma Dorothy always seemed upset lately. Marcus and Stephanie had told him I was busy with my own friends, which Jake interpreted as me having become popular and important. In his 8-year-old mind, I had transformed from the quiet, sad grandmother to someone with an exciting, mysterious life. That conversation with Jake crystallized my final understanding of the situation. I hadn't just punished Marcus for his cruelty, I had freed myself from a dynamic that was poisoning all of us. Jake would grow up seeing his grandmother as an independent, adventurous woman rather than a cautionary tale about becoming burdensome in old age. Marcus would learn that love and respect are earned, not automatic, even within families, and I would continue building a life based on my own choices rather than other people's expectations. As I watched Marcus and Jake drive away that afternoon, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. Dorothy had indeed taught my son an important lesson about independence and self-respect. She just hadn't intended for me to be the one learning it. Sometimes the most painful betrayals lead to the most liberating transformations. Sometimes walking away from people who don't value you is the greatest gift you can give yourself. My 59th birthday is coming up next month, and I'm planning to celebrate it on a wine tour through Tuscany with Eleanor and 3 other women from my book club. We're going to toast to second chances, new friendships, and the courage to rewrite our stories when the first draft isn't serving us anymore. Marcus hasn't called since our coffee meeting, but Jake sends me secret texts about his school projects and soccer games. That connection gives me hope that future generations can learn from the mistakes their parents make. The most important thing I've learned is that teaching people how to treat you sometimes requires walking away from relationships that have become toxic, even when those relationships are supposed to be sacred. Blood doesn't automatically create respect, and sacrifice doesn't guarantee gratitude. But choosing yourself even later in life can create possibilities you never imagined existed. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to cut ties with family members who took your love for granted? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that it's never too late to choose dignity over desperation. Until next time, keep believing in your own worth.